Hi everybody, welcome back. Today we're going to be discussing reflexes and other problems in the spinal cord. But if you haven't watched the spinal cord anatomy video and drawn out this picture yet, please make sure you go back and do that first before watching this video. So there are 4 different types of reflexes and we're going to go through them. There are 4 different types of reflexes. They are known as stretch, tendon, flexor withdrawal, and crossed extensor. So those are the ones that you're going to be required to know. And remember that a reflex is that sudden, unexpected series of predictable events. So the reflex always happens the same way. When it happens or why it happens is the sort of unpredictable part. And also a reflex does not have to check in with the brain to have a motor response. So this all happens in the spinal cord. We're not necessarily asking the brain to make a plan and sign off on it. Even though the brain does find out about it, it finds out about it usually after you've already made your motion. The one most people are familiar with are stretch reflexes. This is the thing that happens when you go to the doctor and they whack your knee with the little hammer thing, which I think there's a more specific, a more medically appropriate term for that. So what happens is when they hit it, they're actually hitting that patellar ligament. And that's causing the patellar ligament to push in a little bit and pull down on the patella and stretch on the tendon that is attached to the rectus femoris. And really what the body is trying to do is protect this muscle from getting stretched out. It's worried that the muscle is going to stretch too much, and so the response is to actually shorten, to contract the muscle a little bit, which is why your leg kicks out, because this muscle contracts. So what's happening is the receptor, somatosensory receptor, is going to pick up the pull on the muscle, and that neuron is going to run into the spinal cord on a spinal nerve. It's going to separate out, go onto the dorsal side. Remember dorsal, because that's where all somatosensory information goes. Here's our dorsal root ganglia, which contains our unipolar neuron cell body, and then it's going to run into this posterior horn. Now with this one, it's very special and very simple. Remember before we talked about interneurons and how the sensory information comes in and it synapses with an interneuron and then some other stuff happens and then the motor neuron takes things out. In a stretch reflex, it's what we call a monosynaptic reflex. And monosynaptic, well, we know what mono means, that's one, and synapse is a synapse. So monosynaptic means there's one synapse. So what happens is this sensory neuron comes in and it's going to synapse directly with the skeletal motor neuron. So you can see that right here. That's its cell body. And it's going to synapse right here in our anterior gray horn. So we're literally skipping the interneuron. We're saying, no thank you, we don't even need it. And this motor neuron is going to come out and it's going to innervate this muscle and it's going to cause muscle contraction. So remember when we talked about muscle contraction and we said the action potential comes down the motor neuron, well there it is. That's going to cause this muscle, rectus femoris, to contract, and it's going to cause this leg to kick out because the rectus femoris action is extension of the knee. And all of that happens so quickly that your brain isn't even involved in the decision. It's fast, it's unplanned, but it'll happen this way every single time. So what your doctor is actually checking is whether or not your spinal cord is working when he hits your patellar ligament. So this is monosynaptic. The other thing is it's called ipsilateral. ipsilateral means it's happening on the same side. So if he hits your right leg will kick out, and you notice it's all on the right side of the spinal cord. Nothing has crossed over that gray commissure. Remember, that's the gray commissure here. Nothing's crossed over and nothing's happening on the other side. It's not like your other leg is going to kick out and kick him also. So that's a stretch reflex. This is the simplest kind because it has one synapse and it's on the same side, and it's a very simple movement. And it's really there to protect this muscle from getting too long. So it's called a stretch reflex because we're nervous about the muscle getting too stretched out. So that's the first one. Second one is a little bit more complicated. This is the one we actually talked about here. And it's not monosynaptic, okay? So this is actually called a tendon reflex. And this is polysynaptic. Meaning there's more than one synapse. So if you can imagine, what the body is worried about here is the opposite of what it was worried about in the stretch reflex. In the stretch reflex, we were worried about it getting too long and stretched out and maybe tearing. Here, we're worried about the muscle contracting too much. And so this one is actually going to cause the opposite thing. It's going to cause the knee joint to flex. It's going to cause, instead of kicking out your leg, it's going to cause the opposite reaction. So let's start here. The sensory neuron, I should start in blue. The sensory neuron is feeling the amount of tension in the rectus femoris tendon. There's a lot of tension. This thing is really contracted. So that sensory information is going to come in on the dorsal side. Here's the dorsal root ganglion. Here's our cell body of our somatosensory neuron. And we're going to come in to this posterior gray horn. Remember, this is where sensory neurons synapse. And what you'll notice here is there's actually a couple of different synapses. So this is where our polysynaptic reflex comes in. We've got two different interneurons that are going to do things. One of them is going to cause contraction of the antagonistic muscle. So if we follow this out, here's our skeletal motor neuron. We're going to follow this out, and because the body is worried about the rectus femoris getting too tight, we're going to actually cause the leg to flex at the knee by causing muscle contraction on the opposite side, on the hamstrings. Also has to happen is we have to have an inhibitory response. So remember, we've talked about inhibitory responses before. The inhibitory response is going to go out and it's actually going to stop that rectus femoris muscle from contracting. So if both of these are contracting, that's a problem. You don't want that because they're antagonistic. But we're going to stop this one and say, yes, go for it, contract on the other side. This is going to lengthen and loosen this muscle, and the feedback will be that this tendon won't be quite so tight. Now what you notice here is that we have one sensory neuron coming in, branching off, splitting into positive, excitatory, and negative or inhibitory interneurons, and then both of those are going out and either inhibiting muscle contraction or signaling muscle contraction. At the same time, this information is also going up to the brain. So the brain is not actually involved in running this. So for the skeletal muscle, one of them, this one, is going to inhibit or hyperpolarize the motor neuron. And number two over here is going to depolarize the antagonistic motor neuron. Okay, so that's the tendon reflex, and it's called a tendon because we're measuring the amount of stress and strain on this tendon area. This is exactly what I drew before when we were talking, and I was saying the sensory neuron comes in, we have this interneuron that's involved, and it's going to send out some kind of skeletal motor instructions. All right. The third one is the flexor withdrawal. Okay, so this again is polysynaptic. There's more than one synapse that's happening. And this has to do more with pain. So imagine you step on a tack. Well, that sensory information is going to be collected by the receptor. It's going to be brought in on the dorsal side. Here's the dorsal root ganglia. Here's the cell body for our somatosensory neuron, and it's going to come in here to the posterior gray horn. And then we're going to synapse with a couple of different interneurons. So one of them is just going to say, hey, pick up your leg. You just stepped on something painful. So that's like a normal motor neuron that's just going out and causing contraction of the hamstrings so that the leg will flex. However, something we haven't seen yet is an ascending and descending tract. So from this sort of slice of the spinal cord, we can go up to the next slice, or we can go down in a descending tract to the next slice down. And we're going to synapse there with another interneuron, which is actually going to expand the response. So this is going to synapse with a motor neuron, which is also going to cause skeletal muscle contraction. And it will help because this is a really big muscle, and we need to have lots and lots of different motor units contracting at the same time. A motor unit is one motor neuron and all of the muscle fibers that it controls. So each one of these is controlling a lot of muscle fibers, and we can recruit other neurons to help with contraction of the whole muscle. Now, this is still ipsilateral. So ipsilateral, remembers, same side. We are not talking about crossing over the gray commissure yet. Forgot to say this is synapsing in the anterior gray horn. So we have these ascending and descending neurons that can recruit nerves from other spinal segments. Okay, our last reflex that we're going to discuss today is called the crossed extensor reflex, and this is really the most complicated one yet. As you can see, there's a lot of synapsing going on, so this is a polysynaptic reflex. In addition, what's happening is we're actually getting both sides of the body involved, and so those interneurons are crossing over that gray commissure. So we'll get to that in a minute. Let's start at the beginning. You stand on something painful, step on a tack or a Lego, and that sensory information, that pain, is going to travel up to the dorsal side. Here's your dorsal root ganglion. So far, so good. And then we're going to split this neuron so that it can innervate a lot of different ones. Now, first thing we want to do, we stepped on something painful, we want to pull our leg back. So in order to pull something big like your leg back, we're going to recruit other spinal segments. So we're going to have an ascending and a descending tract. Remember, a tract is bundles of axons in the CNS. Ascending just means going up, descending means going down. So we're going to innervate these other interneurons up and down these spinal segments, and all of them are going to tell the skeletal motor neurons to send this signal to contract the muscle on the back of the leg, the hamstrings. So when the hamstrings get the signal to contract, they will cause flexion of the leg. Now, if you're standing on your leg and you decide to flex it to get it away from whatever that terrible, painful thing was, of course you're going to fall down unless you put your other leg down. So we have to cross over to run the other side of the body. Remember, this side of the cord runs the right side of the body. If we want to run the other side of the body, we have to cross over. So that's going to happen right here. We have these commissural tracts that are going to go through the gray commissure. And then we're going to have ascending and descending tracts over here to affect a lot of change. The change is going to be, we're going to have the effectors are going to be the muscles on the front of the opposite leg. So these are going to contract at the same time as the other ones are contracting. So if these are your legs, one of them is going to contract and one of them is going to kick out. And it is fast and it is unplanned. And as you can see, there are some neurons that are going to go up to the brain and just let the brain know. But in general, all of this is happening at the level of the spinal cord. That's why it's a reflex. You don't need the cerebrum to be involved in planning or perceiving the information. So not only is this a polysynaptic response, it's also what we call contralateral. And this means that it crosses over. Remember, all the other ones we've talked about so far are ipsilateral. Okay, so I always think of crossed as crossing over. Now, one of my students at one time noticed, well, what's with this one? This is almost the same thing, but you don't have that contralateral response. I think that the book did a disservice by using this analogy. They could have very easily have shown you putting your hand down on a tack and pulling it back, because that's really what we're talking about here. This would never happen because you would always revert to the crossed extensor reflex if you're standing. You have to, or you're going to fall down. So it's not a great analogy. It's not. They should have written it as, you know, your hand. But just know that it works the same way. It is an ipsilateral response in that you don't have to get the other side of the body involved. Whereas for this one in particular, because we have weight on both of our legs, or one of our legs at some point, it's going to have to cross over and be a contralateral response.
Make sure to continue on to the next video, which is about branches of the spinal nerves. See you in class.